Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Lex and I will be your host for today's webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this important conversation today. Think HQ is really excited to bring you this webinar in collaboration with the Butterfly Foundation. However, before we begin and as we wait for some more people to join us, I would just like to go over some really quick housekeeping notes to ensure that today is as smooth and engaging as possible for everyone. So today's session will be recorded and you will be able to access it at a later date. All attendees will therefore have their microphones muted and cameras turned off. For any tech problems, please use our Q&A function. If you do have questions regarding the content of the presentation, please email us at butterfly@thinkhq.com.au. And if you have burning questions throughout the session today, you can also drop them into the Q&A and we'll make note of them and get back to you. Closed captioning is also available and you can turn this on easily by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I would also like to flag a content warning. Today, we will be talking about mental illness, specifically eating disorders, and there will be conversations about bodies, food, and exercise. And while we do go to great lengths to ensure that such themes and lived experiences are shared safely, we are aware that this kind of content can make people feel uncomfortable or bring feelings to the surface. If that is the case, we ask that you please jump off at any point and reach out for support should you need it. You can always call Butterfly's helpline, which is 1-800-ED-HOPE. Awesome. So a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the second episode of the 2024 Think HQ webinar series. We are thrilled to partner with Butterfly to spark an important dialogue about the sensitive portrayal of eating disorders and body image across all forms of communications. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend this respect to all First Nations people, especially those joining us today. We embrace reconciliation and support truth-telling and First Nations self-determination. I am dialing in from the lands of the Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. So again, my name is Lex. I am a PR account director at Think HQ, and we're proud to be Butterfly's communications partner. Think HQ is a full-service comms agency working with like-minded clients to create positive outcomes for people, places, and our planet. We are a group of over 90 talented and diverse people working on campaigns and projects that drive positive change. Butterfly is Australia's leading charity for eating disorders and body image, and together we deliver campaigns centred on reducing stigma, increasing awareness, and encouraging help-seeking behaviours. Next week marks Body Image and Eating Disorders Awareness Week, or BIEDAW, where we will officially launch Kindly Do, Kindly Don't, Butterfly's latest awareness campaign. This campaign focuses on how our words and actions can have unintended but profound impacts on those around us and even on ourselves. In Australia, more than 1 million people are living with an eating disorder, and research shows that while awareness surrounding eating disorders and body image is improving, stigma remains, which means that problematic dialogue continues both in the media and in the everyday. As communicators, we play an especially critical role in discussing, reporting on and portraying eating disorders in a way that is sensitive, compassionate and accurate, and most of all in a way that dismantles harmful stereotypes and authentically amplifies the voice of lived experience. So today's webinar will explore the real-life impact of problematic comments and harmful reporting with tips on kindly do's and kindly don'ts, tangible actions you can implement into your day-to-day and into your work. But before we dive in, a quick reminder, if you do have any questions or comments, please email us, butterfly@thinkhq.com.au, and we'll get back to you. But for now, let's officially kick off. I'm so excited to introduce our speakers today, including Kate Mulray, Butterfly's Lived Experience Manager, who will be joined for a discussion with lived experience advocates Lumen Gorry, Lexi Crouch, and Jane Murphy. Please first welcome Kate.
Thank you, Lex, for the introduction and for welcoming us here today. My name is Kate and I'm the Lived Experience Manager at Butterfly. I am speaking to you from the warm but very windy lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The point of this webinar today is really to deepen our understanding of eating disorders and body image. But beyond that, we aim to encourage a positive change in how each of us talk about our bodies, other people's bodies, and more generally, the way we talk about food and movement. Unfortunately, we do live in a world where dieting and unrealistic beauty standards are deeply ingrained, and it can be easy to get caught up in misconceptions about eating disorders and health more generally. At Butterfly, we talk about eating disorders and body image concerns being about 10 years behind in the way we talk about things like anxiety and depression. However, conversations like the one we're having right now play a really big role in challenging harmful stereotypes. By talking openly, we can create a more inclusive and empathetic community where everyone feels valued, no matter their body or appearance. Today, we are going to be hearing from individuals with a lived experience of eating disorders and body image concerns to hopefully do some learning and potentially some unlearning too. We will be debunking some myths surrounding eating disorders and diet culture. We will then specifically look at the role media can play in safely reporting on and discussing eating disorders and body image, and how they can be more conscious of not spreading diet culture. Lastly, we'll offer some tangible tips each of us can apply to our own lives, both personally and professionally. Before I introduce the other panelists and before we get stuck into the conversations today, I do want to give you a brief overview of Butterfly, provide some information on what eating disorders are if you're not overly familiar with them, and give you a little bit of a snapshot of the current landscape of eating disorders in Australia. So Butterfly is the national charity for all Australians impacted by eating disorders and body image concerns, and for the family, friends, and communities who support them. We provide innovative, evidence-based support services, treatment, and resources, delivering prevention and early intervention programs, and advocating for the needs of our community. Butterfly operates a national helpline that includes support over the phone, via email, and online, reaching over 20,000 people each year. Because Butterfly recognises that eating disorders often arise from poor body image, we deliver a range of prevention programs, including body image workshops to schools and workplaces. So as I said, for those who might not be overly familiar with what an eating disorder is, they are serious, complex, and potentially life-threatening mental illnesses. They are characterised by disturbances in behaviours, thoughts and feelings towards body weight and shape, and or food and eating. Eating disorders have detrimental impacts upon a person's life and can result in serious medical, psychiatric, and psychosocial consequences. There is no single cause of an eating disorder. However, known contributing factors include genetic vulnerability, psychological factors such as perfectionism and obsessive compulsiveness, trauma, sociocultural influences such as Western beauty ideals and diet culture, and other risk factors include low self-esteem, body dissatisfaction, dieting, and thin ideals. Eating disorders affect over 1.1 million Australians each year. However, we do know that number would be higher if more people were coming forward for help, and we know that stigma and misconceptions are some of the biggest barriers for help seeking. Prevalence is increasing. Since 2012, eating disorders in youth has risen by 86%. We also saw very high rates during COVID. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, and more people die each year due to eating disorders than the annual national road toll. I think it's also important to note that most people think of anorexia nervosa when they think of eating disorders. However, anorexia nervosa only accounts for 3.5% of eating disorder presentations, compared to others such as binge eating disorder, which accounts for over 20%. So that information tells us that prevalence is increasing, but I think the fact that only 11% of Australians are confident that they can recognise the signs of an eating disorder is very concerning, which is why increased education and awareness is vital. As Lex mentioned, this week is Body Image and Eating Disorder Awareness Week, which we fondly refer to as BIEDAW. This year, Butterfly's theme is Kindly Do, Kindly Don't, where we'll be sharing actionable and valuable reminders of ways we can all avoid appearance-based, diet culture, and fat phobia-driven comments and actions. While we do absolutely appreciate that people are often well-intentioned, this campaign is a kind reminder to all of us to be more mindful of how our words and actions can impact others, especially those living with or recovering from eating disorders or at risk of developing one. We are very lucky to be joined by three incredible individuals, each with their own lived experience of an eating disorder. I want to take a moment to thank each of you for taking the time to be here today. It does take a huge amount of strength and courage to share your personal experiences, all with the intention to raise awareness, reduce stigma, and help others. So we are very grateful for you. Firstly, I will introduce Jane. Jane is an HR specialist in her day job. She is very passionate about how meaningful connection and communication can break the cycle of eating disorders and create equity and access throughout the community. Secondly, we have Lexi, who lived with an eating disorder for 15 years and has gone on to make a full recovery. She is a lived experience recovery coach and a clinical nutritionist based in Brisbane. We were just talking about how hot it is in Brisbane, so hopefully you have your aircon on and staying cool. Drawing upon her own experience and evidence-based approaches, Lexi has made it her mission to help others on their journey. And Lumen, who is a multiply neurodivergent, queer, non-binary, trans, chronically ill and disabled person. They work as a clinical psychologist, deeply values the voices and power of lived experience, and are passionate about supporting folks in the community through connection, inclusion, advocacy, accessibility, and systemic change. So a very warm welcome to the three of you, and I'm very excited to get chatting. So let's jump into the conversation and look at our first kindly don't. Unfortunately, and it really upsets me that this is one of the biggest misconceptions, but some people do believe that eating disorders are a lifestyle choice or a diet gone wrong, an issue born out of vanity, or an attention-seeking strategy. Lumen, I touched on earlier that there is no single cause of an eating disorder. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and why you feel this misconception is harmful?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So, in terms of the way that I conceptualize eating disorders, I believe that eating disorders are trauma responses and they are social justice issues. So like Kate just said, yeah, eating disorders are not a choice. They are not something that is grounded in vanity or anything like that. And even when, eating disorders may be something that is heavily impacted, for example, by appearance expectations or standards, considering the fact that we live in a world, in a society that puts so much emphasis on those things, like the trauma that can inherently confer to folks in that world and trying to just get by as best as they can. And so in terms of my experiences, yeah, my eating disorder absolutely was not a choice. No one would actually ever choose to have an eating disorder. And mine was very much something that developed as a trauma response because my internal world, my understanding of self, my experiences, and my identities were ones that had essentially been sort of just like steeping in shame for years. And so when I was unwell and when I went through treatment and recovery, I hadn't yet come to understand that I am trans, that I am queer, that I am an autistic ADHD, chronically ill, like all of these other things. But I did know that there was something different about me at my core. But without understanding all of those identities of mine, this really manifested as me believing from really early on, like childhood onwards, I can remember feeling that there was something innately wrong with me. And so the eating disorder was very much this experience of just a multitude of factors all coming together. Part of it very much being terrified that there would be anything that someone would criticize me for. And so wanting to erase the possibility that there was any room for that by adhering to any sort of, expectations or norms. It was also onset really coincided with when I started to go through puberty, and I retrospectively really recall the intense fear that I had about my body changing, particularly in relation to secondary sex characteristics, which I now recognize as being extremely incongruent with my gender and identity. So yeah, it was never a matter of like lifestyle choice or a diet gone wrong or anything like that, but it was that I was essentially like bending myself so far into expected shapes that were never mine to take, but that had been imposed upon me by society. So I guess like quite ironically, it was not a lifestyle choice of mine, but it was the impacts of a lifestyle that were chosen for me by the world. And in terms of treatment and recovery, there was still a really significant time after going through treatment and recovery before I was able to understand my identities. And as a result of this, you know, the way that treatment was sort of, you know, done in a very kind of like cis heteronormative, neuronormative, so assumptions of, you know, being cis and straight and neurotypical, for example, you know, in terms of treatment modalities, also in terms of the ways that eating disorders were typically presented by society, by media, things like that. All of those things really also pathologized my existence, sorry, and I couldn't really properly understand what I was experiencing or why I felt these ways about myself. And for a number of years, kind of had this like, oh, I guess this is like, I guess I'm happy enough, I'm tolerating things enough, I'm doing all the things I've been told to do, but it didn't really bring like actual kind of like I guess like there was recovery in like a very kind of like physical kind of domains. I was able to do like, you know, so much more with my life, but there was still quite a bit that was missing in terms of that sense of self. And of course, like I am my sample size of one, I only speak to my own experience of that, and that's just a very small kind of snapshot of things. I think when we think broadly about like the harms of this misconception of eating disorders being a lifestyle choice as well, like that really reinforces all of those stereotypes and stigma, that shame that people might already be, or pretty much definitely are already feeling about what they're going through in themselves, the inaccessibility of support. And I think it can really perpetuate or compound, you know, the ways that we often see eating disorders as being things that might be quite enduring or long-standing for folks, because there is so much being missed in that picture. And the concept of an eating disorder being a choice also really reinforces the idea that, you know, someone brought this upon themselves. And it therefore fails to recognize like all of the sociocultural factors, all of the experiences that person has had in the world, and all of the systemic kind of factors and issues that are involved in eating disorders. Again, recognizing that they are social justice issues and trauma responses, and yeah, really, I think an integral part of recovery for me and for a number of folks that I know. It has been kind of this reclamation of self and forgiving of self, and so disentangling all of these things that we've internalized. And a lot of that is grounded in those feelings of shame, the blame being placed kind of like unfairly upon us as individuals that we've internalized. And then in reverting that, finding things that are actually like meaningful and sustainable for our well-being, for having, you know, like support, access to community, all of these parts of life that are so important. And I think that's where the choice lies as well. It's like kind of figuring out like who we are in self-determination for recovery and identity, as opposed to this narrative of eating disorders being a lifestyle choice. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such an articulate response and for giving us a little bit more insight into what the contributing factors were for you personally, and reiterating the point that they are never a choice. No one would ever choose to have an eating disorder. We will go on to our next kindly don't, which is kindly don't talk about dieting or placing moral value on food, e.g. good or bad. Before I throw a question to you, Lexi, I just want to take a moment here to talk about diet culture. When we refer to diet culture, we are referring to a set of ever-changing myths about food and bodies. And dieting culture kind of promotes the idea that one's body weight automatically equals health and someone's worth, and that foods can simplistically be categorized as good and bad. It also comprises a moral hierarchy of bodies that preferences the thin ideal or the muscular ideal, while masking a fear of fat, which is what we refer to as fat phobia. These cultural ideas are driven by broad systems and structures of power, such as patriarchal ideas about women's bodies, racialized ideals about thinness and health, and capitalist industries that profit from body dissatisfaction and confusion around food and eating. So Lexi, you're a clinical nutritionist and you have a lived experience of an eating disorder. So I know that you have a lot of thoughts on this topic. Can you share with us a little bit about how diet culture played a role in the development of your eating disorder, and also just touch on how you navigate diet culture now?
Oh, absolutely, Kate. And this is probably one of my passion topics as well. So thank you for asking. I am 36 years old. So I grew up actually in the 80s, where diet culture was very prominent in a way that I don't think we knew it was going to have the impact that it has had on many people today. So if we think back, and there might be many of you in the audience today, this was a time where Weight Watchers was very prominent. This was a time of Jenny Craig, and we seem to have had a lot of these very rigid rules, these very calculated ways to measure what we thought was health, but it was actually just weight loss. Like nobody actually said that this is going to help you obtain health. It was more this fixation of weight would equate to that went on to have quite an impact into how many of us see food today, the way that we speak to ourselves and others around us, and also as a mum, very interestingly, how that can reflect on our kids today. So for me, this was a huge part growing up. It was basically how I was wired. You know, kids are little sponges. So, you know, this is exactly what we thought of the world. And again, this is just where society was at a time. I believe we were experimenting with what health was and, you know, getting to where we were today, where we have broadly so much more information about nutrition, about what we should eat and why we should eat, rather than the rigid protocol that we used to have. So this was me, though, when I was very little. And I took a lot of this on board, and it was something that my mother had practiced. This was something that had been passed on from her mother. It was just, I know many people can relate. My story is not unique in that sense, that kind of put that way of life of how I thought it should be. And this honestly went on to give me disordered eating, and then went into having an effect of an eating disorder at a very young age. It was around 7 years old that I was picked up to have very disordered eating that full-blown went into an eating disorder. So that was how my world was. Instead of being a little girl predominantly, where I should have been thinking about cake or, you know, maybe fairies or something, it was this very rigid thinking about food, weight, shape, and also experiencing some bullying on top of that to basically insinuate that I wasn't okay, even at 7 years old. So I was very much exposed to this way of thinking, I like to say it, because it's coming out into recovery, I think, very differently now. I would say back then, everything was in black and white. Everything was measured in data. Everything was so definitive, whether food was good, whether food was bad. And that's not how I think now, coming out on the other side. However, that took a very, very, very long path to undo. So where I see life now, I'm making my own recovery, which honestly, I see it as probably the best discovery in my life, to be on the other side now, to see the world in such a different place. It's really made me passionate about diet culture in general. And I'm doing that programming entirely around the thoughts about everything. So I guess in that sense, I did fall into the space of becoming a clinical nutritionist. It wasn't so much about, you know, I think there is also a conception about or misconception about a lot of people go on to study food after eating disorders. And, you know, there is always that query to go, are they recovered, or why are they doing this? It was actually, I did this for personal reasons to know deeper about food. So I wanted to diminish those rules of calories. I wanted to diminish the input versus output to get the experience of what does food do for you, in the concept of what do I need to make my brain think? What do I need to do to balance my mood through nutrition? And I guess in that sense, have a very worldly and broader view on that, on what food actually does, rather just being scared of it in a linear approach, which I had been for years. So in that sense, diet culture was something that definitely took over my life. And it just was so ingrained in the sense that, you know, it was just regular conversations. And, you know, these conversations still go on today. As I said, I'm a mother, and I still hear different conversations, you know, that, you know, a lot of people have, as I guess my era, have grown up in that 80s kind of era, in that 90s era, where it was a conversation where, oh, I can't eat dessert today because that's so naughty. And it's still the messaging that's kind of being passed down. It was like it was given, you know, a value on your worth, where I think when you make a recovery, you just really want to feel good, I think, and not have any of these rules around that. So it's something that I've incorporated when I work with clients as well, to try and see the bigger picture, to shut down any conversations that's within yourself and also around. It's, you know, nobody is going to stop you from saying, hey, I'm not comfortable about talking around food or talking about body shape. We've come a long way to know that, you know, that it's a very personal kind of experience for everyone of what we do with our nutrition and what bodies need. And that needs to be acknowledged in that sense. But I guess my biggest passion topic on the diet culture situation is to stop that conversation now in the school ground for the kids, because unfortunately it does still happen. My daughter, she's 8, and not from her personally, but there have been conversations that take place. So it's an area that I'd say kindly change the conversation and, you know, kind of start to get some education around thinking outside the box. So, you know, letting go of that black and white thinking, which is very common with eating disorders. I might add, you're on a very linear pathway for something that I did personally. Everybody's experience is different, but it's learning to kind of harness that and again, change those conversations.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, diet culture was so overt in the 80s and 90s, and it still well and truly exists, but it's a little bit more insidious in the way that it shows itself now, especially being masked by this wellness culture that we live in. So the more that we can kind of recognize it, the more we can, you know, make little steps ourselves to dismantle it. Okay, so the next kindly don't is to assume you know whether someone has an eating disorder by looking at them. This is one of the biggest misconceptions out there, with 1 in 5 people in Australia thinking that you can tell by looking at someone whether they have an eating disorder. And there's also a common misconception that eating disorders have a specific look. It is important to make the point here, and I'm sure Jane will reiterate this point, that eating disorders are a mental illness and we cannot tell what is going on in someone's brain by looking at them. Eating disorders can impact anyone, regardless of gender, age, sexual identity, cultural background, shape or size, or socioeconomic status. So Jane, can you tell us a little bit about atypical anorexia, what it is and what your experience of it was?
Yeah, of course. First, I'd like to say, like, wouldn't it make Butterfly's job a lot easier if you could tell just by looking at someone? So for me, I had well over 10 years of atypical anorexia, which for me presented as having a really restrictive pattern of eating, whilst being someone who presented in a larger body. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that happens. And actually, it's extremely common for someone with a restrictive eating disorder to present in like an average or above average body. And that experience of just being someone in a larger body who also comes to realize that you've developed an eating disorder is absolutely wild, because it both really prevented me personally from coming to terms with the fact that the stuff I was doing was not healthy, was not improving my well-being and that kind of thing. You know, I think delayed my recovery, my introduction to even considering that question for years and years and years. And then at the same time, like, profoundly impacted my interaction with my own recovery. I think when we think about like how we talk about people in larger bodies, you hear things like, you know, the disease of obesity, how important it is to lose weight, all of this kind of thing. And as has already been touched on, weight is like a really poor indicator of health. Yeah, it's an exhausting and really difficult position to find yourself in, because you both have to fight the battle of accepting that you need to recover and that recovery will be the best thing for you and all of that kind of thing, which is a process, or at least it was for me. And then also come across this world of stigma that is telling you that actually your body is not okay the way that it is.
And you talk about, you know, stigma and the fact that you had to reconcile having an eating disorder whilst living in a larger body. I'm wondering whether that stigma extended into your help-seeking journey, and if you experienced stigma in healthcare settings.
Absolutely, 100%. I was so embarrassed about raising the idea that I might have an eating disorder with my GP when I realized that I needed some help. Because I just thought this person is going to look at me and go, that makes no sense. And like gratefully, my GP was really wonderful about it and made all of the referrals and all the help she could get for me. But two things happen after that as a person in a larger body. One is I was ineligible for lots of kinds of support because I wasn't presenting in the way that people expect. And eating disorders are serious at all shapes, sizes, presentations, and in all phases of an eating disorder. It's preferable to not have one than have one. But also presenting to people seeking support from them and not having them trust my experience that I truly was dealing with a restrictive eating disorder. The first professional I saw in the eating disorder space after I'd been referred by my GP just would not believe me. And we had like an extended argument about the fact that I had a restrictive eating disorder and not a binging eating disorder, which was very distressing, very difficult when I had only just ticked over to thinking that I needed treatment and having to advocate for this person that, like, yes, this is the condition I have. And I feel very fortunate that I chose to like continue pushing on. And to this day, when I'm years into recovery, if I go to a specialist or something and I might say, you know, I need help with this or that, and the issue of whether I should change my diet or lose weight comes up almost every time because I'm presenting to them in a larger body. Even when I tell them it's off the cards because I'm someone who's recovering or recovered from an eating disorder, it's a really difficult and sad situation. And it also, like, it makes me pretty angry sometimes, because my body is deserving of good treatment and I deserve to have a happy life. Controversial, I know.
Well, it makes me pretty angry as well. And so much of the work that we do at Butterfly and the wider ED sector is trying to educate GPs and health professionals, because, you know, unfortunately, there still is that lack of education and there still is that misconception even within the health professional sector that eating disorders do have a look. And while we continue to do that work, what we also want to do, and what, you know, is empower individuals to be able to have conversations with health professionals as well and have that kind of dual approach, because we often and unfortunately hear from our lived experience community how help seeking can be very unhelpful and triggering, especially if people don't fit into certain boxes that health professionals can sometimes prescribe. So what we've actually done is develop a script resource to help our community advocate for themselves, like you did, Jane, in these settings. And if you would like to learn more about this resource, please scan the QR code at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's now focus more on the role that media can play in safely reporting on eating disorders, but more generally how they can be more conscious of how they might be contributing to or perpetuating diet culture and fat phobia. I do firstly want to acknowledge the importance of media covering eating disorders and body image concerns. The role that you play in raising awareness and sharing lived experience stories is imperative to our cause. So a very big thank you for anyone on the webinar who works in the media. A big thank you from Butterfly. So on screen are a few of our kind of recommended kindly do's and don'ts for media and for media to be aware of. Lexi, when we were chatting the other day, you mentioned that you feel media have come a really long way in how they portray and report on eating disorders. However, I think it is important to speak about the potential dangers of articles or broader media that reference specific behaviours or metrics or use imagery like before and after images. Can you talk a little bit about what impact these could have on someone who might be struggling?
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just say that media has done a fantastic job and come such a long way, as you mentioned, Kate. I've had the privilege of, I think, back when it was just coming to light, when we're starting to really have the conversations about eating disorders, that I was approached and had the privilege to share my story and have been featured in media a few times. And, look, it was a learning place for all of us, I think, because, this is a new issue that we're trying to bring to light. We're trying to spread awareness and essentially help others. And I believe that that's why we do have this in media. And for, I guess, safer measures now, Butterfly has stepped in and they have made a phenomenal guideline for media that doesn't help just a journalist, but it's also helped someone, I guess, in their younger experiences with lived experience to kind of know the prompts, kind of know the things to follow, because has been a really big experience, I think, in my world. I think I've been working closely with media for probably about 8 years now. So there have been some different angles and there's been some different things, but ever since those guidelines have been released, so many of you, if you're in the audience, you've taken the time to really look and get to know the individual, and you have been absolutely a delight to work with in that sense, to see beyond of what society might always just see an eating disorder has been. However, there have definitely been times where I think media has might like to have seen it as, I think, more of a physical illness, which I think, Jane, you just encapsulated that so well. And thank you so much for sharing, because there's definitely been times, I think in my own experience as well, that yes, I was somebody that fell into what they think the mold is of the traditional white Australian girl, atypical, small-framed anorexia. But I can tell you there were times when I was recovering and in a larger body where I was struggling at weights that were higher in that recovery journey that didn't actually reflect when I was kind of in a smaller body. But what media was kind of looking for, and I think before the guidelines came in, were visual pictures, and we know media is visual. So it kind of made sense to have a picture of a smaller body, to go look at this in a way that might think that somebody is struggling a lot more than somebody in a larger body. So it was kindly, I guess, addressing media or anyone working there to say, look, the reality is eating disorders are a mental illness. For somebody, they can be internally dying in a larger body rather than the smaller one. So that doesn't give the message that we're wanting to help others in that regard. But in the sense, it's been around, I guess, that way that media has in the past a little bit. And I'd like to say, I don't know if anyone is overseas that wasn't actually from Australia. Australian journalists have been really empathic and I guess wanting to actually explore the story of best to help others. And I wanted to thank anyone who was there personally, because it's been such a great experience. Many of you have actually checked in after and personally followed up to see if I have been okay. We've had great liaison with the Butterfly Foundation as well. And from my experience, it's just getting better. So thank you even for being here today. It shows that you've got an interest and you want to learn. And those have been the things to really follow as well, to know that it is not just about the visual weight. And I guess I'd like to also add, of just being aware that a lot of people are working in media for the first time with lived experience, that they can be very open and wanting to share, but it's, if you're talking about behaviors, if you're talking about data particularly, I don't disclose data at all personally, because I don't think that is important. And I know personally the impact that has on friends that I've had with eating disorders as well, that taps into their self-worth, and that's not what it's about. So it's steering clear of the imagery, staying clear of data, and basically wanting to address like what is happening about the actual illness that people can relate to in that sense. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said, while it definitely is getting better and there are now resources that exist to help the media, there still are occasions where really specific information is shared. And sometimes the experience might offer that, thinking that it's just between them and the journalist and it can get published. And for someone who might be struggling with an eating disorder to see that specific information, it can potentially be very triggering for them. But also with the nature of the illness, it can lead to copycat behaviours too, and give people ideas that they otherwise might not have had. So we always try, as you said, Lexi, to kind of focus on the impact of the illness and what that person is going through, rather than that kind of headliney type specific information that really might, or that is not helpful. Jane, in terms of media and the role that it plays in perpetuating diet culture and fat phobia, I'm curious to hear whether you think it does play a role, and if so, what are some of the examples of this and how have they made you feel?
Yeah, it absolutely plays a role. I've been reflecting quite a bit about this recently, and I was thinking about, like, Jane as a young person, who were the people that I kind of saw in the media that reminded me of me. Now, for context, I just came into the world with big shoulders, big lungs, like big thigh muscles. I'm just like a big kind of a person. I also just generally live in a larger body. And I remember, like, engaging in the world, engaging with media, and the people that I saw that I went, that's a person like me, were not positive representations, are actually really sad representations looking back. I remember, you know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I was like, I'm like Augustus Gloop. I remember, yeah, all of these times, Harry Potter being like, I'm a lot like Dudley. These horrible villainous characters. And the only one I could think of someone that I remember thinking, that's a person like me, that wasn't like a miserably sad character who was either like mean or the pre-glow up person or something like that, was Fiona at the end of Shrek. And like, I am glad that I had Fiona, but also Fiona is literally an ogre. So I don't know that that was like speaking very well to like giving me a super positive like role model of someone that reminded me of how I looked. And conversely, becoming an adult and getting access to way more media than I had as a young person in the 90s and 2000s, getting to finally see like all kinds of people living in all kinds of bodies and their joy and their lives and their experiences and that kind of thing, that weren't just sad, mean, nasty characters or literally a monster, was incredibly inspirational and powerful for me to realize that I could have a recovery and be a whole person who was important and deserved to be happy. Because I remember, like, for years and years, feeling this deep shame about my body and feeling like it was impossible for me to ever be happy unless I lost weight and had the body shape that I had like developed the perception was ideal. And I think about how sad it is that there was this little girl, this teenager, this young adult who was like, I cannot be happy unless I completely change myself. And that's, yeah, I think that's really tragic. And so my like kindly do is kindly do show all kinds of people doing all kinds of things, because that representation actually really shapes our brains and our experiences of the world and all of that kind of thing. And just getting to see people that kind of reminded me of me has been so powerful and important for me.
Yeah, I think the point about representation of all different types of people and all different types of body shapes and sizes across all media, in whatever field you work in or whatever space of media you work in, is incredibly important to remember. And I do want to kind of throw to you, Lumen, to talk about the importance of representation and sharing diverse experiences, and ask you, is there anything that you would like the media to change or to be more aware of?
Thank you. So yeah, there are many things that come to mind. And of course, like I never discuss these things in a way of being like, hypercritical of the work that folks are doing. But like with this approach of, like we can all continually aspire to be doing better. Because we're all always learning and things are forever unfolding. But yeah, things that come to mind is like, the ways in which stereotypes and lack of representation can come through are just absolutely immense. Like that might be in extremely overt ways in how things are presented, really presenting like a very specific narrative, or it might be in really kind of things that seem small, like certain language that are used, like a type of photo that's used, like things that aren't captured in what's being, described or presented. I think like irrespective of whether like something is like kind of big or small in terms of like what the kind of actor aspect is, like the impact of that is still really significant, and can still be extremely harmful in terms of all that it taps into, and sort of speaks to, things that are sort of like really kind of like everyday almost examples of this is, like how often we see, like eating disorders being discussed with like stereotypical photos of like, a set of scales or a measuring tape, or things like that, or someone that's, like got their head in their hands kind of thing. And, that's again, such a kind of, narrow representation of what things are like. And then also the self-stigma that can put onto folks. And yeah, there's also, when certain stereotypes are, being maintained, like that really compounds and also often entails like, the pathologization of experiences and erasure of folks' different experiences. And I think like the exclusion of folks, like, yeah, as mentioned, it really does maintain that stigma, that shame. It also leads to and kind of it sort of stems from and perpetuates, a real lack of understanding of what eating disorders actually are. It results in things being misidentified, and also of, eating disorders being missed entirely in folks. Like there are so many people that continue to like slip through the cracks. And, all of these like having quite narrow representations, it impacts folks on an individual level. And also, again, yeah, really socioculturally and systemically in terms of like how folks are perceived, whether they're taken seriously, type of care that's accessible, and a lot of, kind of, I think it's so vital to ensure that we're kind of, talking about things in a way that is kind of capturing of so many different experiences. Because like if you've met one person with an eating disorder, you've met one person with an eating disorder. There is no single way that these things are. Every single individual is different. I think in media representation of things, I think it's so important to be having that diversity, but also doing so in a way that is safe. So not conflating sort of, like various identities or experiences or marginalized, marginalized intersecting identities as being things that cause eating disorders. Especially when those might be identities or experiences that are already discriminated against or stigmatized or have tragedy narratives applied to them. Like as a trans person, as a multiply neurodivergent person, something that I am acutely aware of is when we start talking about prevalence of eating disorders amongst trans folk, there is a lot of transphobic rhetoric that emerges as a result of that, and says that, like transness, like it, actually, I'm not going to go into it because I'm like, it's a whole thing, but like, there's so much that states that like, it results in this pathologization of gender and saying, oh, like this is this terrible thing that causes an eating disorder. And it's like, no, eating disorders arise because of these sociocultural factors, and a lack of access to safety and gender affirming care and things like that. Similarly, when we think of, like disability, neurodivergence, for example, like for folks that are autistic, again, like when we're talking about eating disorders, and again, eating disorders are extremely common amongst neurodivergent folk, for example, autistic folk, ADHDers, when those things are not talked about or understood in an identity affirming safe way, it can result in this kind of doubling down on or like compounding of harm and shame and stigma. And Yeah, so I guess like digressing, like there are a multitude of factors that, you know, result in an eating disorder. I think of it as kind of being like this, like the iceberg analogy. If, you know, on the surface we might see what's, you know, like classified as, you know, like things surrounding like food or exercise or body or weight, but sitting underneath that is aspects of trauma, ableism, inaccessibility of care, neurotype, physical health, mental health, unmet needs, disability, sociocultural pressures or ideals or norms, discrimination and violence surrounding someone's identity, you know, queerness, race, weight, appearance, status in the world, and that's just a non-exhaustive list. Food insecurity, poverty, socioeconomic status, employment status, things like that, and just like survival. And so yeah, really being careful that we don't just kind of keep sort of zeroing in on this one specific narrative. And I think in terms of reporting those things safely as well, again, like I think having that responsibility to stay away from harmful rhetoric and to be safe, being mindful of any biases, including those ones that we might subconsciously be holding, and you know, even having scope for, you know, consulting folks of lived experience to check in around appropriateness and sensitivity of how we're talking about things, how we're presenting things. And yeah, so yeah, I think, yeah, there's been such an incredible amount of change in how things are being talked about. But as we continue to learn more about all of these things, there is always that ongoing sort of unfolding kind of, you know, things that we can continue to do better in. And I think an approach that I take in sort of so many of these things, and also my work, I work as a psychologist, is despite being, you know, even someone of community with lived experience and things, always holding space for being wrong and learning more, and that receiving feedback on things, or, you know, how we might better present things is not a, you know, a targeted criticism, you know, of self. It's like an opportunity to learn and do better for so many folk that our work might impact.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to note the different intersections relating to eating disorders and not just reporting on that one very obvious narrative, not to diminish that narrative, but also to make sure that there is representation of all the different factors that you have just discussed, but also, you know, just reiterating the importance of doing that as safely as you possibly can and being committed to learning throughout the process. Okay, so we are coming towards the end of the webinar, and to wrap up, we wanted to leave you with some tangible do's and don'ts on the screen that each and every one of us can strive towards. And I'll just go over a couple of these now. At Butterfly, we know that loving your body, being positive about your body, accepting your body, or even feeling neutral about it can be really hard. And we do encourage everyone to be kinder to their bodies, because our relationship with our body is the longest and arguably most important relationship we'll have in our lives, and they do an awful lot for us. Self-compassion really is key. If you find your inner bully going off, think whether you would ever say those things to your best friend. And if not, then try to not say them to yourself. And that's something I try and practice on a daily basis. We encourage you to never comment on someone's weight. I hear, you know, still so often people say to others, wow, you've lost weight, you look great. Firstly, we don't know why someone may have lost weight. They could be grieving, they might be unwell, they might be living with an eating disorder. And secondly, when we celebrate weight loss, we are continuing that narrative that thin is better, which we have learned today isn't and shouldn't be the case. Our research also suggests that people stop doing things they love because of their body image concerns, like going to the beach or maybe going out on a date. Please don't wait to be a certain shape or size. It won't guarantee happiness or a better body image, and you deserve to live your best life and to be loved no matter what you look like. And lastly, don't offer unsolicited or unqualified health advice, and be very mindful about where you're receiving your health advice from too. We see too often nutrition and movement advice coming from all different places and content creators who are not qualified or who offer that kind of one size fits all approach. So we just encourage you to find what works for you and your own well-being with the support of qualified individuals. So just to finish off, we've just got a few minutes left. I just want to ask our wonderful panelists if they could just share, and they've already shared lots, but if there's one kind of obvious kindly do or kindly don't that you would really like to reiterate before we finish up. So Jane?
Yeah, my kindly do / kindly don't is kindly do let yourself and others experience the joy, community, connection, deliciousness of food, and kindly don't like create those barriers of shame. Shame is so pervasive and it's antithetical to joy. So let your body just be joyful. You only have like one very short life, so just do it.
And Lex?
So my favorite, I was going to say, kindly do remember that there is always a person under there. I think I've seen this so much, and this was quite significant to my own recovery. I grew up personally with Lexi and anorexia. And I remember the most fundamental shift in my own recovery was when someone looked at me as a person. Just beyond that, I stepped into a therapist's office and we didn't talk about eating disorders that day, and I boomed. So it's just remembering that, because that can be a narrative for somebody for so long and it is not them. So at the end of the day, everybody is a person. And I feel like if you look at a soul, if you look what is underneath there, it just brings the person back home in there. And then my kindly don't would be just the broader kindly don't judge. You just never know weight, shape, what someone's done for that day, their experiences of anything that could impact not just on weight, but in general, is just please kindly don't judge until never really. So those would be my two.
Yeah, great. And Lumen?
So mine are also, yeah, sort of interrelated as Jane's were. So I think like my kindly don't is kindly don't force assumptions or standards or expectations onto folk of what a meaningful or affirming existence is like for them on their behalf. Like every single individual is so unique. And again, when we're thinking of those very kind of like things that are held so important as part of eating disorder recovery, it often talks about like all of these, I guess, like for lack of a better phrase, like again, like quite normative standards of like, this is what recovery will look like for you, this is how you feel, this is what you'll be doing. And that might not be accessible for a lot of people, or it also might not be meaningful for a lot of people. And with an extent, so sort of extending on that too. So yeah, really kind of like seeing the individual, as Lexi was saying, yeah, like seeing the individual as an entire person, knowing that they are the expert in their own experiences, even if they're also still in the process of figuring out who they are and what they need. And always, treating folks with dignity and humanity and really supporting their autonomy, because so many of the approaches that often exist are extremely carceral and traumatizing and dehumanizing. And yeah, just really, I think, advocating for folks when they might not be able to advocate for themselves, and always having their genuine well-being at the crux of what we're wanting to focus on and support.
Yeah, beautiful. Couldn't agree more. So thank you so much to Jane, Lexi and Lumen for your invaluable insights, and a huge thank you to everyone for attending the webinar today. It personally makes me feel really hopeful that each of us can play a role in actively learning and unlearning, and as a result be more mindful and conscious in the way we speak about these topics to contribute to positive systemic change. You can find out more about the campaign using the QR code on the screen. And of course, if today has brought up anything for you, please reach out for support. And we have Butterfly's helpline details up on the screen.
So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and a massive shout out to Kate, Lim, Lexi, and Jane for facilitating such an important and compelling discussion, and of course for your ongoing advocacy. This kind of work is so vital in encouraging people to seek support, and we are so grateful for you all sharing your experiences. As mentioned, this recording will be available for you at a later date to refer to and watch. In the meantime, please email any follow-up questions or comments to the butterfly@thinkhq.com.au email. If you are a journalist or a producer hoping to cover BIEDAW in some capacity, we do ask that you reach out and that we can work together to make sure that your reporting is safe and in line with all of the points discussed today. Thank you again for joining, and we do hope to see you in the next webinar, and have a nice rest of your day.